A millionaire saw two hungry little girls sharing one small breakfast in the rain, saving half for their sick grandmother. He thought it was just a moment of kindness, until a powerful man tried to take the girls away, and the truth behind their family nearly shattered everything he had just found. The rain came down in thin silver threads over downtown Seattle, tapping softly against the striped awning of Harbor Light Cafe. The city moved in its usual rhythm, horns in the distance, hurried footsteps, the smell of roasted coffee drifting into the damp morning air. At the corner patio table sat Cassian Vale, 34 years old, founder of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America, and a man whose life ran with the precision of a machine. His watch read 7:15 a.m. exactly. Black coffee, tablet open, quarterly projections glowing cold and blue across the screen. Numbers were safe. Numbers behaved. Cassian rarely looked up, not until he heard a voice so soft it should have disappeared into the rain. "Eat slower, Lark." The whisper drifted from the next table. Cassian's finger froze above the screen. "Grandma has to eat too." He looked up. Two little girls sat on a metal chair across from him. Their coats were thin and worn, their shoes damp from puddles. A small paper plate of scrambled eggs and toast sat between them like treasure. The older one, maybe 6, carefully tore a piece of toast in half. Her long, dark blonde hair clung in wet strands around her cheeks, and her blue eyes carried a seriousness that didn't belong to a child. The younger girl, 5, perhaps watched the plate like it might vanish. Her fingers were red from the cold, but she waited obediently. "Just a little bite," the older girl said gently. "We have to save some." "For Grandma," the younger one whispered. The older girl nodded. Across the patio, the billionaire who had built a $2 billion empire in 8 years stared at them. For the first time that morning, the numbers on his screen meant nothing. Because suddenly all Cassian Vale could see were two hungry little girls trying to divide breakfast between 3 people. And something inside his carefully controlled world shifted quietly but forever. Cassian told himself to return to the screen. He had investor calls at noon, a board briefing on Monday, an entire Asian market expansion waiting for his attention. Instead, he kept watching the girls. The older one pushed the plate closer to her sister. "Take another bite, Lark." The little girl shook her head, curls bouncing stubbornly. "You didn't eat yet." "I did." "You had 1 bite." "That counts." Lark studied the plate again, then picked up the tiniest forkful of eggs imaginable. She chewed slowly like someone who had already learned the mathematics of hunger. Cassian's chest tightened. He closed his tablet. The movement startled them. 2 pairs of blue eyes turned toward him at once. He stood, suddenly aware that he had no idea how to talk to children. "Morning," he said carefully. The older girl straightened immediately, instinctively protective. "Good morning?" Her voice was polite but guarded. Cassian gestured toward the empty chair beside them. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" She hesitated, not shy, calculating. After a moment, she nodded once. Cassian sat. Up close, he could see details he'd missed before: damp sleeves, a patched seam in the girl's coat, a faint smudge of dirt across Lark's cheek. "Are you two here alone?" he asked. The older girl answered without hesitation. "Yes." Cassian frowned. "Where are your parents?" The question landed heavier than expected. The girl's gaze dropped to the plate. "We have Grandma," she said quietly. Beside her, Lark carefully folded half a slice of toast into a napkin and slipped it into her coat pocket. Cassian noticed. "For later?" he asked gently. Lark nodded. "For Grandma." The rain fell a little harder outside the cafe, and Cassian Vale suddenly realized something uncomfortable. 2 children were planning their morning around someone else's hunger, and no one else in the world seemed to notice. Except him. Cassian stared at the small paper plate. The eggs were nearly gone now. The girls had eaten like birds, carefully, slowly, as if each bite required permission. "What are your names?" he asked. The older girl lifted her chin slightly. "Wren?" She touched the little one's shoulder. "And this is Lark." Lark offered a shy wave. Cassian nodded. "I'm Cassian." Neither girl reacted to the name. That was oddly refreshing. Wren wiped her hands on a napkin and began wrapping the remaining eggs carefully. "Are you taking that home?" Cassian asked. "Yes. To your grandmother? She's sick today." The words were spoken simply, without drama. Cassian felt something twist inside his chest. "How far away is home?" Wren pointed down the street. 3 blocks. Cassian looked at the tiny bundle of food in her hands. Then he stood. "Wait here a second." Before Wren could object, he walked back into the cafe. 5 minutes later, he returned carrying a paper bag heavy with groceries, breadfruit soup medicine, and 2 warm pastries. He set it on the table. Wren blinked. "We can't pay for that. I'm not asking you to." She frowned immediately. "Grandma says we shouldn't take things from strangers." Cassian crouched so they were eye level. "That's very smart advice." He offered his hand. "My name is Cassian Vale. Now we're not strangers anymore." Wren studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she shook his hand. Lark gasped softly when she saw the cupcakes inside the bag. "Those are for both of you," Cassian said. Wren lifted the bag carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Cassian." The rain had softened into a gentle drizzle. "Show me the way," he said. The girls stepped off the curb together. Wren walked with quiet determination. Lark skipped beside her, one small hand reaching instinctively for Cassian's. He hesitated only a moment before holding it. And just like that, a man who had built his life on control and distance followed 2 tiny strangers into the wet Seattle morning. Without realizing, he was walking straight toward the past he thought he'd buried forever. The apartment building stood on a quiet street near the Seattle waterfront, its faded blue paint peeling from years of rain and salt air. Flower pots lined the small staircase, most of them empty except for stubborn green shoots fighting through the cold. "This one," Wren said, stopping at the 3rd-floor door. Lark squeezed Cassian's hand a little tighter. Wren knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slow footsteps approached from inside. The door opened a few inches, and a woman appeared, thin, pale, her silver-streaked hair pulled loosely behind her neck. She looked tired. More than tired. Her breathing was shallow, as though every breath cost effort. "Wren," she said softly. The girls rushed forward. "Grandma," they wrapped their arms around her waist, nearly knocking her off balance. Cassian stepped forward instinctively to steady her. And the moment his hand touched her arm, the woman froze. Her eyes lifted slowly. They landed on his face. The color drained from her cheeks. For a long second, she simply stared. Then her voice trembled. "Cassian." The name sounded like it had traveled through decades to reach him. Cassian's breath caught. There was no mistaking her. Elowen Hart. The woman who used to tuck frightened children into bed at St. Bartholomew Children's Home. The woman who once made animal-shaped pancakes for a lonely 9-year-old boy who had nowhere else to go. The woman who had disappeared without saying goodbye. Time folded in on itself inside the narrow hallway. "You know," Grandma Wren asked. Cassian's voice came out rougher than expected. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Elowen's hand tightened on the doorframe as another cough shook her chest. And suddenly the past Cassian had buried for 25 years was standing in front of him, fragile, breathless, and raising 2 little girls alone. "Come in," Elowen said after a moment, stepping aside. The apartment was small but warm in a way Cassian's glass penthouse had never been. Soft yellow light filled the living room. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator. A vase of wildflowers sat on the table beside a carefully mended tablecloth. Everything was worn, but nothing was neglected. Cassian set the grocery bag on the counter. "I brought some food," he said. Wren immediately began unpacking it. her eyes widening slightly at the bread and fruit. Lark gasped when she saw the cupcakes. For us, she whispered. Cassian nodded. Elowen watched silently, her expression a complicated mixture of gratitude and pride. You didn't have to do that, she said gently. It wasn't charity, Cassian replied. Lark tugged his sleeve. Grandma Look Soup Wren held up the medicine bottle next, and cough syrup. Elowen sighed softly, clearly outnumbered. Thank you, Cassian. They sat down together at the small kitchen table. The girls ate eagerly, but still tried to leave half the soup for their grandmother. Cassian noticed everything. The empty cupboard, the careful portions, the way Elowen tried to hide how exhausted she was. Then the coughing started again. It wasn't a normal cough. It was deep, heavy, the kind that rattled through bone. Wren froze mid-bite. You're coughing again, she said quietly. I'm fine, sweetheart. But the lie was thin. Elowen pressed a hand to the table until the coughing passed. Cassian remembered that same hand smoothing his hair when he used to wake from nightmares in the orphanage. Now it trembled, and the realization hit him harder than he expected. The woman who once protected dozens of abandoned children was now struggling to breathe in a nearly empty apartment. After lunch, Wren took Lark into the bedroom to show her drawings taped to the wall. The apartment grew quiet. Only the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows remained. Cassian and Elowen sat across from each other at the small table. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Cassian broke the silence. You disappeared. The words were blunt. They had waited 25 years. Elowen looked down at her hands. I know. At St. Bartholomew's, Cassian continued, his voice calm but tight. They told us you'd found another job. One day you were there, and the next day you were gone. Elowen's fingers tightened around her teacup. I didn't leave by choice. Cassian frowned. The board cut half the staff, she said quietly. Budget changes. They told me I had 24 hours to leave the housing. Cassian stared. They wouldn't even let me say goodbye to the children, she continued. They said it would disrupt the routine. Her voice cracked slightly. I argued. I begged. But they locked the dormitories before I could speak to any of you. Cassian leaned back slowly. For years he had believed she abandoned him. That belief had hardened into something cold. Now it shattered. You never knew where I went, he said. I tried to find you, she replied softly. But by the time I came back, the records were sealed. You'd already been placed in another foster program. Silence fell again. Then Elowen coughed. Harder this time. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. Cassian stood instantly. That's not just a cold. I'm fine. Another cough bent her forward. From the hallway, two small voices called out in panic. Grandma Cassian was already reaching for his phone. Get your coats, he said. We're going to the hospital. The emergency room lights were too bright, too white. The kind of light that made every worry look worse. Wren sat stiffly in a plastic chair, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Lark leaned against Cassian's side, half asleep, her tiny fingers still clutching the sleeve of his coat, as if letting go might make him disappear. Across the room, Elowen lay behind a thin hospital curtain, while nurses moved quietly around her. Cassian stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching every movement. A doctor finally stepped out, holding a tablet. Family of Elowen Hart. Cassian stepped forward automatically. Yes. The word came out before he could think about it. The doctor studied him briefly, then continued. Her lungs show signs of severe inflammation and long-term infection. It's treatable, but she's been ignoring symptoms for months, possibly longer. Cassian's jaw tightened. What happens if she keeps ignoring it? The doctor's expression softened slightly. Eventually, respiratory failure. The words hung in the air like ice. Behind Cassian, Lark stirred. Is Grandma dying? She whispered sleepily. Cassian turned immediately. No, he said gently, kneeling so he was eye level with both girls. She's just sick. Doctors are helping her. Ren watched his face carefully, searching for truth. Promise, she asked. Cassian hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Then he nodded. I promise. The curtain shifted as Elowen coughed again inside the room. Cassian stood slowly. For years he had believed he had left that helpless boy behind in the past, but standing in a hospital hallway with two frightened children looking up at him, Cassian Vale realized something unsettling. For the first time in decades, someone needed him. And this time, he wasn't walking away. Elowen was released the next morning with medication and strict instructions to rest. Cassian drove them home through a gray Seattle morning. Rain streaked the windshield while the girls whispered in the back seat about hospital machines and the bravery of doctors. When they reached the apartment, Elowen insisted on walking up the stairs herself. Pride was stitched into every step. Inside, Cassian placed the medicine bottles on the counter. You need to slow down, he said. Elowen gave him a tired smile. That's difficult when two little tornadoes live here. Lark giggled. Ren did not. She was watching her grandmother carefully. Cassian reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. I can cover the medical costs, he said quietly. And groceries. Rent too, if needed. Elowen's expression changed instantly. No. The answer came sharp and firm. Cassian, this isn't charity, he said quickly. It feels like it. The tension thickened. Then Cassian leaned against the counter, thinking. What was the name of the restaurant you used to run? He asked suddenly. Elowen blinked. La Belle Table, she said softly. Why, you were the head chef for almost 10 years. Cassian nodded slowly. There's an empty cafe space in the arts district downtown, he said. Fully equipped kitchen. Good location. Elowen frowned. I don't understand. Cassian met her eyes. Don't think of this as help. He gestured toward the girls. Think of it as a business investment. Ren's eyes widened. You mean, Grandma cooking for real customers again? Cassian nodded. Lark gasped. Can we have pancakes? For the first time since leaving the hospital, Elowen laughed. And Cassian realized something strange. Helping them didn't feel like generosity. It felt like coming home to something he didn't know he had lost. 2 days later, Cassian stood with Elowen and the girls in front of a quiet storefront in Seattle's arts district. The windows were dusty. The sign above the door had faded from years of weather. But the location was perfect. Artists' studios lined the street. Small galleries and coffee shops buzzed quietly nearby. Morning sunlight spilled across the sidewalk. Cassian unlocked the door. After you, he said. Inside the room smelled faintly of old wood and coffee grounds. Tables were stacked against one wall. The kitchen appliances still stood in place behind a metal counter. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, filling the empty dining room with warm light. Lark spun slowly in the middle of the floor. Its huge wren walked more carefully, touching the back of a chair as if it might disappear. Elowen moved through the kitchen slowly, her chef instincts waking immediately. She checked the stove, opened the refrigerator, tested the sink. The ventilation system needs cleaning, she murmured, and the prep counter would need replacing. Cassian smiled slightly. You already sound like the owner? Elowen shook her head. I'm 64, Cassian, which means you know what you're doing. Behind them, Lark had climbed onto a chair. This can be my homework table, she declared. Ren pointed to a corner. And that can be the kids' table. Cassian watched them, then looked back at Elowen. You run the kitchen, he said simply. I handle the finances. Elowen crossed her arms. That's a partnership. Exactly. Silence filled the room. Finally, Ren looked up at her grandmother. Please, Lark clasped her hands dramatically. Grandma, imagine the pancakes. Ilawan stared at the empty restaurant for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. And in that quiet, dusty cafe, a future began to take shape. Renovations began the following week. For the first time in years, Cassian Vale's schedule changed. Mornings were still spent inside the glass tower of Vale Dynamics, where executives waited for his sharp decisions and investors demanded constant growth. But every afternoon, Cassian drove across Seattle to the quiet arts district, to the little restaurant that now smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Workers moved in and out, carrying lumber lighting fixtures and kitchen equipment. The dusty cafe slowly transformed into something warm and alive. Cassian found himself doing things that would have shocked his board of directors. He carried boxes. He argued with contractors. He stood on ladders installing lights. One afternoon, he climbed down from a ladder and noticed flour on his sleeve. Behind him, Lark burst into giggles. "You look like a baker." Cassian examined the white powder on his jacket. "I'm fairly certain billionaires aren't supposed to be covered in flour." Ren folded her arms thoughtfully. "Maybe they should be." Cassian raised an eyebrow. Why Ren pointed to the half-finished dining room. "Because this is more important than computers." Cassian opened his mouth to argue, then paused. For years he had believed success meant numbers, expansion strategy. Entire continents had opened under his business plans. But standing in that dusty room, watching a 6-year-old plan where the children's table should go, he felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Ilawan emerged from the kitchen carrying a clipboard filled with handwritten menu ideas. "Cassian," she said, "we'll need a larger prep counter." He glanced at the list. "Already ordered." She looked impressed. "You move fast. That's how I built my company." Ren tugged his sleeve. "Mr. Cassian." "Yes, do you ever take days off?" Cassian blinked. "Not usually." The girl considered this very seriously. "That's sad." Lark nodded. "Grandma says Saturdays are for pancakes." Cassian looked toward Ilawan. She smiled gently. "They're right." For a moment, Cassian stood in the warm light of the unfinished restaurant. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The girls were arguing about napkin colors. Ilawan was writing recipes. And suddenly, the billionaire who owned half a skyline realized something strange. For the first time in many years, he didn't want to go back to the office. Opening day arrived under a pale autumn sky. Seattle's morning rain had finally lifted, leaving the streets clean and shining. The small sign above the restaurant door read, "Ilawan and the Girls' Kitchen." Inside, everything glowed. Soft, cream-colored walls, blue trim around the windows, fresh flowers on every table. The scent of warm bread drifted through the room like a promise. Ren carefully arranged menus, while Lark carried napkins to each table, humming loudly. Ilawan stood behind the kitchen counter adjusting her chef's coat. Her hands trembled slightly. Cassian noticed. "What if nobody comes?" she whispered. Cassian leaned casually against the doorway. "They'll come." "How do you know?" He gestured toward the kitchen. "Because that soup smells like it could bring people back from the dead." Ilawan laughed nervously. At 11 a.m., Cassian unlocked the front door. The girls stood beside him like tiny hosts welcoming the world. Then they waited. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. No one came. Lark's shoulders began to slump. "Maybe they didn't see the sign," she said quietly. Ren pretended to adjust the menus again. Cassian checked his watch, but said nothing. Then the doorbell chimed. An elderly couple stepped inside. "We heard there's a new lunch place," the man said. Ren straightened immediately. "Welcome." Lark nearly bounced out of her shoes. Within 20 minutes, 2 more tables filled, then 4. By noon, the restaurant buzzed with voices, laughter, and clinking plates. The kitchen came alive. Ilawan moved with confidence that had clearly waited years to return. Soup simmered, bread toasted, pancakes flipped perfectly onto warm plates. Customers smiled. One woman leaned over to Cassian and whispered, "This place feels like home." Cassian glanced around the room, at the girls laughing with customers, at Elowen glowing behind the counter, at strangers relaxing in a room that had been empty only days before. For the first time in a long while, success felt different. It wasn't measured in profit charts or stock values. It was measured in something much simpler: warmth. 3 weeks passed. The restaurant became a quiet neighborhood success. Lunch hours filled quickly. Weekend brunch brought lines down the sidewalk. Word spread about the pancakes, shaped like animals, and the soup that tasted like childhood. Cassian divided his life between Vale Dynamics and Elowen and the girls' kitchen. Strangely, the second one mattered more. One rainy evening after closing, the staff had already gone home. Wren and Lark were drawing pictures at the corner table while Elowen wiped down the kitchen counters. Cassian was balancing receipts when the doorbell chimed softly. He looked up. A woman stood in the doorway. She hesitated as if stepping inside might break something fragile. She was young, late 20s perhaps, with dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. Rain clung to her coat. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Then they stopped. On the girls. Her breath caught. Lark noticed her first. "Hello," the little girl said politely. The woman took a shaky step forward. "Elowen?" Elowen turned. The dishcloth slipped from her hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Elowen whispered a single name. "Seraphine." Wren frowned. "Grandma." The woman looked at the girls again, tears gathering in her eyes. "You've grown so much." Cassian felt the air in the room tighten. "Do we know you?" Wren asked cautiously. The woman's voice trembled. She stopped, struggling. Elowen closed her eyes briefly. Then she said the words that changed everything. "Girls, this is your mother." Silence crashed into the restaurant. Lark's mouth opened in shock. Wren's eyes widened slowly. For 3 years, the word mother had been more story than reality. Now she stood in the doorway, soaked with rain and shaking with emotion. Cassian watched carefully, because something about the woman's face wasn't just sadness, it was fear. And as Seraphine stepped further inside, one thing became painfully clear. Her return was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a much more dangerous one. The restaurant fell into a silence so complete that even the rain outside seemed to stop. Wren and Lark stood frozen near their table, staring at the woman who had just been introduced as their mother. Seraphine Hart. For years, that name had lived only in bedtime explanations and gentle half-truths. "She had to go away. She loves you very much. She just can't come home yet." Now she stood in the doorway of the restaurant, soaked from the Seattle rain, trembling as if the floor beneath her might disappear. Lark looked up at Elowen first. "Grandma?" Elowen's expression was tight, conflicted. She clearly hadn't expected this moment either. Seraphine took another step forward. Her eyes never left the girls. "I've missed you," she whispered. The words broke something fragile in the air. Wren's voice came next, steady but cautious. "Why did you leave?" The question was simple, but it landed like a hammer. Seraphine's shoulders sagged slightly. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," she said quietly. Cassian watched carefully from near the counter. Something about the woman's body language, her constant glance toward the door, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, told him this story was more complicated than abandonment. Seraphine looked toward Elowen silently, asking permission. Elowen nodded once. Seraphine knelt slowly so she was eye level with the girls. "When you were very little," she said gently, "I was with someone who wasn't a good man." Wren's eyes narrowed. "Did he hurt you?" Seraphine swallowed. "Yes." The word came out fragile. "But when I tried to leave, He threatened to take you both away from me. Cassian's attention sharpened. Seraphine continued, voice shaking. He said he had lawyers, money, power. He said the courts would believe him, not me. Lark moved closer to Ren, gripping her sleeve. So you ran away? Ren asked. Seraphine nodded slowly. I thought if I disappeared, he would stop looking for you. The room remained silent. Cassian finally spoke. What's his name? Seraphine's eyes flickered toward him. The fear there was unmistakable. Damien Crowe. Cassian felt a chill move through him. He knew that name. Damien Crowe wasn't just dangerous, he was powerful. A high-profile attorney known across Washington for winning impossible cases and crushing opponents without mercy. Alawan looked at Seraphine sharply. You said he was gone. Seraphine's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought he was. She looked toward the girls again. But 3 days ago. Her hands trembled. I found out he's looking for them. Across the room, the rain started again against the windows, and Cassian Vale realized the peaceful life they had just begun building was about to be threatened by something far darker. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It came in a thick white envelope addressed to Elowen and the girls' kitchen. Cassian was in the office reviewing supply invoices when he saw Ren carry the envelope toward him. Someone left this at the door, she said. Cassian immediately noticed the return address. A law firm. He opened it slowly. Inside was a formal document stamped with legal seals. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Then he went very still. Alawan noticed immediately. What is it? Cassian placed the paper gently on the counter. A custody petition. The words hung in the air. Seraphine went pale. Ren frowned. What does that mean? Cassian spoke carefully. It means someone is asking the court for the right to take care of you. Lark's face scrunched in confusion. But Grandma takes care of us. Seraphine whispered the name like a curse. Damien. The letter was signed by Damien Crowe's legal office requesting a formal review of parental custody rights. His claim was simple. As the girl's legal father, he had the right to custody, and he intended to enforce it. Alawan slammed her hand on the table. Over my dead body? Seraphine's eyes filled with panic. You don't understand, she said quickly. He's not just any lawyer. He knows every loophole in family law. He'll drag this through the courts for years if he has to. Cassian remained calm, but his mind was already moving. You're saying he'll try to take them? Seraphine nodded. Yes. Ren had gone completely silent. That was more frightening than crying. Finally, she looked up. Does that mean we have to leave Grandma Lark's eyes filled with tears? I don't want another house. Cassian crouched beside them. No one is taking you anywhere. But Ren was too perceptive. You don't know that, she said quietly. Cassian looked at the letter again. The legal language was aggressive, precise, ruthless. Damien Crowe wasn't asking politely. He was declaring war. Cassian stood slowly. I know someone like him, he said. Alawan looked up. What do you mean? Cassian folded the letter carefully. I've spent my entire career dealing with people who believe power means control. His voice dropped slightly. And I've learned something about them. Ren watched him closely. What Cassian's expression hardened. They're only dangerous when no one stands up to them. The restaurant felt different now. The warmth was still there. But beneath it, a storm had begun. The next week felt like living under a shadow. Customers still filled the restaurant. Plates still left the kitchen. Laughter still echoed between tables. But behind the scenes, tension grew thicker every day. Cassian had already contacted one of the most respected family law firms in Seattle. Documents were being reviewed. Legal strategies drafted. But even the best lawyers had delivered the same warning. Damien Crowe was dangerous in a courtroom. He knew the law better than most judges. That meant the case would be brutal. Elowen tried to focus on cooking. Seraphine tried to reconnect with the girls slowly and carefully. But children always notice when adults are afraid. One evening after closing, Cassian found Ren sitting alone at the corner table. The restaurant lights were dim. "What are you doing up?" he asked gently. She looked up, thinking. "That sounds serious?" Ren pushed a crayon drawing across the table. It showed the restaurant. Grandma in the kitchen, Lark holding pancakes, and Cassian standing beside them. But one corner of the drawing was empty. "Who's missing?" Cassian asked. Ren stared at the paper. "The man who wants to take us." Cassian sat down slowly. "He hasn't taken anyone yet, but he might." The words were small, honest. Across the room, Lark was asleep on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders. Ren lowered her voice. "Grandma says courts decide things." Cassian nodded. "They do. What if they decide wrong?" Cassian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. "Do you trust your grandma?" "Yes." "Your mom?" Ren hesitated. "I'm trying." Cassian smiled slightly. "That's fair." "And you?" she asked suddenly. The question surprised him. "Do you trust me?" she clarified. Cassian leaned forward slightly. "Yes." Ren studied his face carefully. Then she nodded once. "Okay." Cassian frowned. "Okay what? If you're here." Her voice softened. "I'm not as scared." Cassian felt something shift in his chest. For years he had believed strength meant independence. Now a 6-year-old girl had just trusted him with something far more fragile. Her safety. Across the room, the rain began again against the windows. And for the first time since the legal letter arrived, Cassian realized this fight was no longer about winning. It was about protecting 2 small girls who believed he could, and he intended to prove them right. The collapse happened on a Saturday afternoon. The restaurant was full. Steam curled above the stovetop as Elowen moved between pots and pans with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent decades in kitchens. Orders were coming fast. Pancakes, soup, sandwiches. The sound of clinking plates filled the dining room. Cassian was near the counter helping the server carry drinks when he heard it. A pan hitting the floor. Then a gasp. When he turned, Elowen was gripping the edge of the stove. Her face had gone pale. Grandma Lark's voice trembled from the dining room. Elowen tried to wave it off. "I'm fine." But the words dissolved into a violent coughing fit. Her knees buckled. Cassian reached her just as she collapsed. The kitchen exploded into chaos. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. Ren stood frozen in the doorway, her small hands shaking. Lark began crying immediately. Cassian lifted Elowen carefully from the floor. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. "Stay with me," he murmured. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights reflected off the restaurant windows as the paramedics loaded Elowen onto a stretcher. In the waiting room hours later, the restaurant staff had gone home. Only Cassian and the girls remained. Lark sat curled against him on the plastic chair, her head resting on his shoulder. She had cried herself into exhaustion. Ren sat beside them, elbows on her knees, silent. Cassian finally spoke. "She's strong," he said quietly. Ren looked at the floor. "She tries not to cough when we're around." Cassian frowned. "What do you mean she waits until we're asleep?" The words struck him harder than expected. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ren's voice came again. "People always say grown-ups take care of kids." Cassian glanced at her. "But sometimes kids have to take care of grown-ups too." Cassian didn't know how to respond to that. A doctor appeared shortly afterward. "She's stable," he said. "Exhaustion and stress made her condition worse. But with proper rest and treatment, she'll recover." The relief in the room was immediate. Ren closed her eyes briefly. Lark stirred and wrapped her arms around Cassian's neck. "Is Grandma okay?" she whispered. Cassian nodded gently. Yes. For the first time that night, the tension in the room softened. But as Cassian looked at the girls leaning against him, he realized something profound. The restaurant had started as an investment. Now it had become something far more fragile. A home. And homes were worth fighting for. 3 days later, Cassian sat in a conference room overlooking Seattle's skyline. Across the table were 3 attorneys from one of the most respected family law firms in Washington. A thick stack of documents sat between them. The lead attorney, Margaret Chen, spoke first. "Mr. Vale, we need to be clear about something." Cassian leaned back slightly. "Go on." "Damian Crowe is not a typical custody opponent." Cassian already knew that. Crowe had spent 15 years building a reputation as a ruthless courtroom strategist. His specialty was dismantling witnesses and exploiting legal technicalities. Legally, Margaret continued, he is listed as the girl's father. Seraphine shifted nervously in her chair. "But he never cared about them," she said. "He only wants control." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "I believe you. Unfortunately, courts rely on evidence." Cassian tapped the folder slowly. "So we gather evidence." Another attorney leaned forward. "Crowe's team will attack 3 things." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "Which are Eloan's health, Seraphine's disappearance, and your involvement." Cassian expected the first 2, but the third surprised him slightly. "Explain." The attorney flipped open the folder. "They'll argue that a billionaire stepping into the girls' lives creates instability. They may accuse you of manipulating the situation." Seraphine looked horrified. "That's ridiculous." Cassian remained calm. "That's strategy," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Crowe will also attempt to paint himself as the stable option. Wealthy, educated, legally connected." Cassian gave a faint smile. "Those are not arguments I'm unfamiliar with." Margaret studied him. "Winning this case will require more than legal strength. We must demonstrate that the girls are safe, stable, and loved where they are." Cassian's voice lowered slightly. "They are." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Margaret closed the folder. "In that case," she said, "we prepare for court." Outside the window, the Seattle skyline stretched into the distance. Cassian stared at it thoughtfully. For years, those buildings had represented everything he had built. But suddenly, they felt small, because this battle wasn't about companies or markets. It was about 2 little girls who believed he would protect them. And Cassian Vale had never walked away from a fight in his life. The courthouse felt colder than the Seattle rain outside. Tall marble columns lined the hallway. Footsteps echoed across polished floors as lawyers and clerks moved between courtrooms. Cassian stood beside Eloan and Seraphine outside courtroom 4B. Wren and Lark sat quietly on a nearby bench coloring in a small notebook. Cassian noticed something. Neither girl was laughing. The door opened. A tall man stepped into the hallway. Perfect suit, calm expression, sharp gray eyes. Damian Crowe. Cassian recognized him immediately. Crowe's gaze moved slowly across the group before settling on the girls. His lips curved slightly. "Well," he said smoothly, "there they are." Seraphine stiffened. Cassian stepped subtly between Crowe and the children. Crowe's eyes shifted toward him. "You must be Mr. Vale," he said. Cassian's voice remained calm. "I am." Crowe extended his hand politely. Cassian ignored it. Crowe chuckled softly. "I've heard quite a lot about you. I'm sure you have." Crowe tilted his head slightly. "You're an impressive man. $1 billion company. National reputation." His tone remained friendly, but his eyes were cold. It would be unfortunate, Crowe continued, if all of that became entangled in a messy family dispute. Cassian held his gaze. "You mean the one you created?" Crowe smiled faintly. "I mean the one the court will decide." Behind them, the courtroom door opened again. All parties inside, a clerk called. Crowe adjusted his cufflinks. Shall we? Inside the courtroom was already filled with quiet tension. The judge sat at the front bench reviewing documents. Lawyers organized their papers. The air felt heavy with expectation. Cassian helped the girls settle beside Elowin. Lark whispered something into Ren's ear. Ren nodded. Cassian leaned slightly toward them. "Remember," he said softly, "no matter what happens in here, you're safe." Ren looked up at him. "You promise?" Cassian didn't hesitate. "I promise." Across the room, Damien Crowe took his seat at the opposing table. For a moment, his eyes met Cassian's again. This time, there was no smile, only calculation. The battle had begun. The courtroom was silent. Not the ordinary quiet of a legal hearing, but the kind of silence that carries weight. The kind where every breath feels louder than it should. Judge Elena Whitmore reviewed the final documents before looking up. "Before I make my ruling," she said calmly, "I would like to hear briefly from the child." Damien Crowe's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "That is highly unusual, Your Honor." The judge didn't look impressed. "I am aware." Her eyes moved toward the small bench where Ren sat beside Lark and Elowin. "Ren Hart," she said gently. "Would you come forward?" Cassian felt Ren's small fingers tighten around his hand. "You don't have to be scared," he whispered. Ren nodded, then she stood. Her footsteps were small against the polished courtroom floor as she walked toward the witness chair. The seat was too large for her. Her feet barely touched the ground. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Ren," she said kindly, "do you understand why you're here today?" Ren nodded again. "Yes." "And do you know the people sitting in this room?" Ren glanced around. She pointed to Elowin. "That's my grandma." She pointed to Seraphine. "That's my mom." Then she turned toward Cassian. "And that's Mr. Cassian." Finally, her gaze moved slowly across the room. It stopped on Damien Crowe. The air grew colder. "Do you know who that man is?" the judge asked. Ren's voice became very small. "Yes." "Who is he?" "My mom said he's my father." The courtroom remained still. Judge Whitmore asked the most important question. "Ren, where do you feel safest living?" Ren didn't hesitate. She pointed to Elowin, "With Grandma." Then she pointed toward Cassian, "And with him." The judge nodded slowly, and why Ren thought for a moment. Then she said something that made the entire room go quiet. "Because they stay." Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow gently. "What do you mean?" Ren's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady. "They don't disappear." Behind her, Lark suddenly spoke from the bench. "Please don't make us go with the scary man." The words were soft, but they echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Even Damien Crowe's attorney didn't know how to respond. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood something. This case was no longer just about legal rights. It was about trust. And two little girls had just told the truth in the clearest way possible. The courtroom remained quiet after Ren stepped down. Damien Crowe's legal team quickly tried to regain control. "Your Honor," Crowe's attorney began smoothly, "children are easily influenced. Emotional testimony, sit down." The judge's voice cut through the room like a blade. Crowe's lawyer slowly lowered himself into his chair. Judge Whitmore turned toward Cassian's legal team. "Do you have any final evidence?" Margaret Chen stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She called the final witness. An older man stepped forward, broad shoulders, gray hair, and the steady presence of someone who had spent decades facing difficult truths. "Please state your name." "Detective Arthur Mallory, Seattle Police Department, retired." Crowe's expression changed, just slightly. But Cassian noticed. Margaret Chen continued. "Detective Mallory, did you investigate a domestic incident involving Damien Crowe 12 years ago?" Mallory nodded. "Yes." Crowe's lawyer jumped up. Objection. That case was dismissed. Mallory remained calm. It was dismissed because the victim withdrew the complaint under pressure. The judge leaned forward. Pressure from whom Mallory looked directly at Damien Crowe. From Mr. Crowe himself. A murmur spread across the courtroom. Mallory continued. I personally documented injuries and recorded statements indicating repeated threats of custody manipulation against the victim's future children. Seraphine lowered her head. Cassian watched Crowe carefully. For the first time, the man looked unsettled. Margaret Chen placed a small device on the evidence table. One final exhibit, Your Honor. She pressed play. The courtroom speakers crackled. Then a voice filled the room. Damien Crowe's voice. Cold. Controlled. If you ever try to leave me, I will take the children and make sure you never see them again. Seraphine closed her eyes. Crowe's attorney stood again. That recording could be fabricated. Judge Whitmore raised a hand. That's enough. She turned toward Crowe. Mr. Crowe, I suggest you consult with your attorney before speaking further. Crowe remained silent. The judge leaned back slightly. For several long seconds, the courtroom waited. Then she spoke. This court has heard sufficient evidence to determine the best interests of the children. Her voice carried the authority of final judgment. Damien Crowe is hereby denied custody. Lark gasped. Wren grabbed Cassian's hand. The judge continued. A permanent protective order will be issued. Crowe's jaw tightened, but it was over, and everyone in the room knew it. Spring arrived slowly in Seattle. The rain softened. Cherry blossoms appeared along the sidewalks. Sunlight returned to the city in quiet golden mornings. 6 months after the court case, Elowen and the Girls' Kitchen had become one of the most beloved little restaurants in the Arts District. Every Saturday morning, there was a line outside the door. Inside, laughter filled the room. Elowen moved through the kitchen with renewed energy. Her health had improved steadily since she began treatment. Seraphine worked part-time designing the restaurant's menu boards and artwork. Wren handled the front counter like a tiny manager, and Lark still spun happily through the dining room whenever music played. Cassian sat at the corner table one morning reviewing invoices when Lark climbed into the chair beside him. Mr. Cassian, yes. Do you still live in that big, lonely apartment? Cassian raised an eyebrow. Lonely Wren looked up from the register. You said it didn't have pancakes. That's true. And nobody wakes you up on Saturdays. Also true. Cassian closed the ledger. I might have solved that problem. Elowen walked over just in time to hear the last part. Oh, Cassian slid a small envelope across the table. Elowen opened it. Inside was a photograph. A warm brick townhouse just 4 blocks away. 3 bedrooms, a small garden, large kitchen windows. Elowen looked up slowly. Cassian shrugged slightly. It seemed practical. Wren's eyes widened. You're moving closer? Cassian nodded. Maybe. Lark leaned forward. Does the house have room for pancakes? Cassian smiled. It has room for a lot of pancakes. Elowen watched him quietly. Then she asked the question that had been waiting between them for months. Cassian, are you sure this is what you want? He looked around the restaurant, at the girls laughing, at Seraphine decorating a chalkboard menu, at the warm sunlight pouring through the windows. Then he answered honestly. I spent my whole life building things, he said. Companies, buildings, systems. He paused. But this... His eyes moved toward Wren and Lark. This is the first thing that ever felt like a home. Lark climbed into his lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. Wren folded her arms thoughtfully. So you're staying, Cassian didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Outside, the Seattle morning glowed warm and bright. Inside the restaurant, the smell of pancakes filled the air. And for the first time in a very long life, Cassian Vale wasn't building an empire. He was building a family. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next